Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Franzic's Virtual School Law Conference. This is the fourth session of our School Law Conference, and we couldn't be more excited than to have you all join us. To say that the start of the school year has been a unique challenge is an understatement. Just figuring out how or which model to use in your reopening plans has been a challenge in and of itself, but the difficulties are compounded when you add the myriad of bargaining demands that you've received from the unions. So today we wanted to talk with you about some of those unique collective bargaining issues we have seen and the best practices on how to deal with them. Today on our panel, you'll recognize the familiar faces of Franzic attorneys and regular panelists, Shelley Anderson.
Hi, everyone.
Sally Scott. Jennifer Dunn.
Hi, everyone.
And Michael Hernandez.
Good afternoon.
A little housekeeping before we jump in. Thank you to those of you who submitted questions during registration. We have worked those into the Q&A today. Please submit your questions during the webinar using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to cover them all. Please also use the Q&A to share with us any insights you have learned during your back-to-school experience that we can share with our other attendees today. I want to quickly highlight our topic for next week, the OMA meets Zoom. Our team will review common issues school boards face complying with the Open Meetings Act generally and with the extra layer of complication created by virtual board meetings. This session will provide legal and practical insight in dealing with OMA's various requirements in an entertaining format. As always, if you find yourself looking for more information or if we're not able to get to your questions today, please reach out to one of us. If you missed any of our webinars, you can find them all on our website under events at franzic.com. And while you're there, take a look at the many webinars, alerts, blogs, and podcasts on a wide range of school law topics. All right, so with that, let's get started. Sally, can you start out by giving us an overall impression of labor relations and collective bargaining during the pandemic?
Sure, thanks, Melissa. Obviously, the pandemic is unprecedented. And so are labor relations right now. As we will be discussing today, there are topics for bargaining that we've never had to talk about before. We've not had to talk about remote learning, hybrid learning, testing, what you do if someone comes down with COVID, social distancing, and the like. We are also seeing unions being more active and more aggressive than what we have seen them in the past. We've seen the impact of that on the range of issues that are being asked to negotiate and the fervency with they're being negotiated. We've also seen the impact that the unions have had with some districts on plans as they try to determine whether to be remote or hybrid or in person. We're also seeing unions using social media even more than ever before to express their views and gain support for their positions, or try to. And we'll be talking about all these issues a little more today.
Great, thanks so much, Sally. Before we dig into this further, Jennifer, can you remind us of the difference between impact and decisional bargaining?
Sure, I'd be happy to. The overview that Sally just gave, I think, really highlights more than ever the importance of that legal distinction between bargaining over a decision and bargaining over the effects or impact of that decision. But it also highlights the distinction between mandatory and permissive subjects of bargaining and what the parties' obligations are with respect to those subjects. A decision itself could involve a mandatory subject of bargaining that requires that a district negotiate in good faith before making a unilateral change in that area. But a decision also could itself be a pure management right with no bargainable effects whatsoever. In other words, a topic about which an employer has no mandatory obligation or duty to bargain with the union in any way. However, a decision can simultaneously involve a district's inherent managerial right, but the impact or effects of that decision are mandatorily negotiable and something you need to discuss and bargain about with your union. I think what we've seen in the landscape that Sally just described is a general blurring of these lines, where either there's not been clarity around the demands to bargain that have been submitted, where unions simply have requested to generally bargain about the return to in-person learning, perhaps, or where there's been clarity in the initial demand, where it's specific about requesting to bargain the effects of a particular decision, but the discussions at the table quickly turn to a discussion about the decision itself and the basis for that decision. So this is an excellent opportunity to remind our school districts, keep front and center as we approach these types of negotiations. Define clearly what the request concerns, respectfully recognize and reassert continually your managerial right at every opportunity, and honor in good faith the bargaining obligations that are raised and presented. And of course, we're here to help you navigate the continued blurring of these lines.
And school districts are moving between remote, hybrid, or in-person instruction. Do those changes need to be bargained with the union?
So this is actually a question that all of our school districts either have recently faced or are currently facing or seemingly are continuing to face as we experience the waves and surges throughout this pandemic. And the answer is nuanced for many of the reasons I just cited. I think everyone can agree. I think the law is clear. Educational employers are not required to bargain over matters of inherent managerial policy. And the prevailing thought is that the decision to deliver educational services, the decision about the method or means by which those services are being delivered, those are really the type of policy decisions that districts need not bargain about with the union. But so whether that decision early on was to provide services exclusively by way of remote learning or in a hybrid context where some learning is occurring in person or remote, or whether there's a full return to in-person learning, these, again, are the types of decisions that we respectfully recognize are at the heart of an administrative control and decision to direct that district. And we need not bargain about the merits of that decision or, frankly, the metrics or the factors that drive and underlie that decision. So case in point, a school district notifies its teachers that it intends to return to in-person learning on a particular date. While the union demands to bargain about the impact of that decision, that discussion at the table quickly turns to identifying exactly what metrics the district used to make that decision and drive that decision. And suddenly the parties are starting to debate those metrics and the scientific data behind positivity rates, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So again, this is where that distinction between decision and impact bargaining and mandatory and permissive really becomes important. While that decision and the basis for it, you're not debating the soundness of it and whether to pursue it, but you are under an obligation to bargain the impact or effects, where those effects touch on mandatory subjects. Long story short, you're going to need to notify your unions, and you should, about the decision to be remote, be hybrid, be in person, and provide them with the opportunity to request impact bargaining, as well as provide for that opportunity to engage in those discussions.
Thank you. Shelley, have most of the school districts that you work with engage in impact bargaining?
I would say that the vast majority, there's probably only one or two I can think of that they haven't done some sort of negotiation with the union related to some part of the return to school plan. I think what Jennifer just mentioned, though, with respect to things you have to bargain versus issues that arise at the table, the discussion typically begins with that decision by the school district as to what model they're going to be following. And the union wants to have more information about why they got there and how they got there. So it's whether it's a metrics question or a staffing question. And then from that, we get the demand to bargain where they actually talk about the impact of those decisions. I think that a lot of districts, though, with respect to, wondering why there was some delay in districts and unions rather coming to them to demand to impact bargain is because the districts hadn't made the decision yet. So until they put the decision out, the union really doesn't know what it's bargaining because it doesn't know what impact it could possibly have. And now that we're seeing many districts attempt to go back to some sort of in-person instruction, whether or not you were able to impact bargain earlier or maybe enter into an MOU, all of that likely is coming up again as those decisions change and shift. And I think that's one thing that we want to make sure people understand is it's not a one and done deal. As you continue to make changes, the union can continue to come back to you and say, this is an issue, we want to bargain the impact, and this is how we think it has an impact on our working conditions.
Thanks. Can each of you identify some of the issues that have been raised by unions in districts that you work with?
Sure, why don't I start? Safety. Safety-related issues have been important subject matter at the table. Some examples included personal protective equipment, modified classrooms, collateral workspaces as well.
Great. Shelley?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that across the board, the biggest issue that I have been dealing with all the school districts I work with is some way relate to leave issues. So whether or not it is related to, you know, what happens if there's an exposure at school, does that person have to use their leave under the FFCRA? What happens if they've exhausted that? Do they have to use their own sick leave? Is there going to be a sick leave bank of some sort? How are we going to treat the support staff versus teachers, for instance, where the teachers typically get much more sick leave than the support staff do? How are we going to handle requests that come in to work from home, or do those people have to take a leave of absence if there's not a remote position available? So really, every nuance you can think of around leave, I feel like districts are all handling. And again, a reminder that depending upon what your model is, will likely depend on how you handle those issues. So just because, you know, many times the union comes and says, well, Shelley, we know that you're bargaining with this school district also, and you agree to this. And we have to kind of make sure that everyone remembers every school district is unique because your plans are all unique. And just because one district is able to do one thing does not mean that another district has to follow that same path.
Great. Sally, do you have anything to add to that?
Sure. I'll add, actually picking up on what Jennifer was talking about. The unions are raising a lot of things that don't need to be bargained. So beyond the issues that Jennifer talked about relating to decisions that don't need to be bargained or metrics that don't need to be bargained, we're also seeing unions raise issues relating to students. For example, you know, what kind of, they want to bargain what discipline is imposed on students if a student refuses to wear a mask, or what kind of screening should be in place for students. Or even other staff as well, right? They want to bargain the duties of the custodians, for example, because they want them in the classroom cleaning. So, you know, a lot of areas the unions are asking about are things that you may not have to bargain.
Great, thank you so much. Now, how do you formalize agreements made from impact bargaining?
Jump in here for a quick few general points. First, if you're engaged in impact bargaining and you've negotiated in good faith and actually reached agreement on a number of issues, as a general matter, that statutory duty to bargain in good faith requires that you reduce that agreement to writing and sign it. And it also, you know, the refusal to do so as a general matter constitutes or could constitute an unfair labor practice in and of itself. Beyond that, there may be some additional nuances, you know, however, because in the particular circumstances in which impact bargaining is occurring, there may be, you know, an extenuating circumstance. And the best example I could give is maybe you're in the middle of successor contract negotiations, overall renegotiating, you know, the successor contract, and the agreement that you reach, the tentative agreement, is subject, I think we're all familiar with this, a ratification vote of the entire membership in the bargaining unit. But you may be doing some of this midterm, and where the topics that you agree to in, you know, maybe a standalone MOU or MOA or letter of agreement, it may or may not address specifically matters that have already been addressed in your settled collective bargaining agreement, or it may impact them. And there may be some nuances about, does that need to be subject to a ratification vote of the entire membership? It really extends from the authority that the people you're dealing with at the table have. Also, you know, whatever the party's past practice has been in negotiating these types of agreements in the past. So with that said, I guess I'll throw it out to my fellow panelists. Has this question about signing off on whatever, you know, the agreement has been at the table, has this been an issue or posed an issue?
Yeah, I've had mixed experience. Okay, so we have an MOU, the union agrees to sign it. We've limited it. We've limited it to the first semester because these are changes. We don't know what's going to happen for the full year, and they already want to talk about the full year. But I've had some unions that said, no, we don't need to sign anything. There's been an exchange of documents, an exchange of new protocols that were adopted by the district, or an exchange of a PPE chart that's being maintained. And the union said, well, we really don't have to sign off on anything at this time. So the district moved forward and they unilaterally implemented. So we've seen, I've had a mixed bag.
Yeah, I would say that with respect to something that Jen just mentioned in terms of making sure that the people at the table have the authority, I think this situation presents itself in a very new way. And I get a number of questions about, what does this look like? Do we put together the entire bargaining team that we typically use when we're bargaining a successor contract, or is this something different? And I think that as long as you make sure that The district has the people on its side that can have the authority to make these decisions, as well that you're speaking to the union, people who actually have the authority to make a decision. And I would probably find out early on if, for instance, there's going to be some requirement that there is a ratification vote, or if this party that you're working with, the individuals across the table, have the authority to make those decisions, and then it can just go to the board for approval, or perhaps the parties at the table themselves just sign off on it. So as far as process, the one caveat I'll say though, is that what I'm seeing a lot of is that even where board members aren't typically involved in bargaining, I have seen a number of unions specifically request that a board member be present because of the highly controversial nature of some of the issues that are being bargained. So, I wouldn't dismiss that outright just because you typically haven't done it in the past. I would try to understand a little bit more. And oftentimes it's just that the teachers on the union side want to make sure that the board really hears what their concerns are. And that can actually be a good thing in my experience in getting things resolved.
Supposed to leave it off of mute. Mike, I know you've worked with a lot of school districts and helping them develop their reopening models. Can you talk a little bit about your experience and how the teachers unions were involved, if at all?
Yeah, so again, as Jennifer indicated, the decision on what teacher delivery model, what learning model to use, and then whether or not the schools are going to be open, that's the district's decision. It doesn't mean you're not either haven't or won't be getting teacher input. Because teachers are part of the process. And how does this arise? There could be a provision in the CBE and the CBA with respect to a committee, or the district's past practice with regarding either a curriculum or a scheduling committee. So there is some interaction there. But where the duty to bargain arises is the impact on wages, hours, and working conditions. And to the extent that those are implicated by remote model, everybody's at home. So what implications do we have there? Hybrid model. Well, we have teachers in, students may not be in, or we have half the students in and half the students are at home. And we're going to be talking about modified classroom and issues like that. And then what about a phased in full return? Again, that's another issue where, again, the wages, hours, and working conditions may be implicated. And then, what we're seeing now is an adaptive pause possibly for some districts. Are they going to close again? That's another issue, another matter that may raise bargaining issues.
Thanks. Shelley, you had mentioned leave issues as a topic for impact bargaining. Let's drill down into this and explore what you're seeing.
Well, I think I touched on a few of them earlier. So if we start with the FFCRA, for instance, one of the issues that's come up is we all know that depending upon why you're taking that leave depends on how much money you get paid per day pursuant to the law. And again, let's remember, school districts don't get reimbursed for this. So this is just money that these staff members get if they need to take this leave. So part of what we're seeing bargained is, do they get to use a portion of their own sick leave, for instance, to make up for the amount of money they otherwise would have earned on that day? So that's one issue we're seeing. Another issue with respect to leave is the developing of a COVID sick leave bank, for instance. I've certainly seen that proposed by a number of districts, accepted by one or two that I work with, being outside and different from the typical sick leave bank. Going back to, in terms of when you're on leave, if someone is requesting to take an expanded FMLA, for instance, because they have childcare issues, is the district going to allow them to take a remote working position or not? And when we think about that in terms of, well, what are you really bargaining there? It's that notion of, are we going to allow people to take that remote position, have a remote positions available, or are we going to put a kind of line in the sand and say, this is not something that we're going to allow, and if you need the leave, you're going to have to take the childcare leave. And sometimes it doesn't work out that way because the pay for that is obviously so much less. Now, that's not necessarily that's not necessarily something the union should have a say in, but certainly it's a discussion that's happening at the table because it is affecting so many staff members as schools around them where their children attend are going back and forth from remote to hybrid. So also kind of how you're going to manage through that. And again, those are leave issues discussed at the table, not necessarily something that the district and union have to come to agreement on. But as we all know, staffing is such an issue right now. I recommend the more discussion you can have and agreement with the union as to how to handle this, so they can help work through their teachers and make sure that we're getting everyone where they need to be, is the best idea.
Let me add to that too, Shelley, something that I've been seeing as well are requests for accommodation because of family members that the employee believes are vulnerable. So we know that employers have obligations under the Americans with Disabilities Act, FMLA, the Coronavirus Recovery Act to provide certain kinds of leave. But they don't require that you provide leave for an ill family member overall. There may be some FMLA exceptions, but for the most part, if an employee wants a leave because their family member is vulnerable, they're not going to be entitled by law to a leave. But unions are asking that leaves be given in those situations, or that employees be allowed to work remotely in those circumstances. And so that's another area where we've been seeing a lot of bargaining requests.
Yeah, and just to add quickly to the comments I made earlier, the one issue that I think that is related to this that we do need to bargain over, for instance, is if your district only has a certain number of remote positions. So because of your staffing model, you've determined you only need 20 remote teachers. Determining which teachers who have requested accommodations, for instance, might be something that you do need to bargain with the union. So for instance, are you going to base it on, so let's say all 50 people who've made requests have a legitimate accommodation request that would require them to work remotely. How are you going to decide who gets those 20 remote positions and who otherwise will have to take a leave of absence is something that you may very well have to bargain with the union, whether it's based on what certification they have, what they can teach, whether it's seniority, things like that. I've seen a lot of discussion around that topic with unions as well.
Thanks. Before we move on to the next topic of safety and some additional impact bargaining there, we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A that we're going to go ahead and answer. So first question is, the teacher's contract and support staff contract both expire June 30th, 2021. The bargaining units have asked to bargain a one-year extension. How do you recommend the administration prepare? What might be a good goal or a win? And what types of issues might you predict could be brought to the table? Jennifer, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I think a couple of points on this. Number one, everybody needs to have a very clear understanding of what a one-year extension is going to look like and what bargaining over that one-year extension would be. From my perspective, and I think from management's perspective overall, that is typically a very limited set of negotiations, primarily limited mostly to wages. If anything else beyond that, that's really rare. But it's not outside the realm of possibility that they're just thinking short term and they're still wanting to bring everything to the table. And that frankly doesn't quite make sense if it's just going to be a one-year extension, a one-year rollover. Really, it's contemplating not doing what you normally do in preparation for bargaining, which is come up with, the whole host of issues and try to work through them in a very long, bargaining round of negotiations. So your prep is really going to be driven by that, and it should be limited because it's going to be a limited set of issues for that extension. If you can get it, the extension itself is the win. To not have to be engaged in what is turning out to be a lot of protracted negotiations and continual negotiations, getting that extension and not having to be at the table at that time, I think that's the win in and of itself.
To add to what Jen's saying, the ground rules here are really important. So you want to know before you're going into those negotiations, if we're going to talk about a one-year extension, it's only going to be wages, or it's only going to be wages, health insurance, and one other topic, or whatever your limitations are. But frankly, you put way too much time and effort into negotiations when there's a large host of issues to have a one-year contract. So Jen's exactly right on that. You need to limit it. That's the win, but you need to know that going in so both sides have the same expectations.
Thanks. And I think the next question actually is a good tie-in to our next subject of safety. So this person says, I posed the question to our food service leadership regarding cleaning tables between lunch periods. The union president responded that this would be fine. Does she have the authority to make this decision? Or do we wait to see if members are opposed to doing this? Jennifer, do you want to weigh in on that?
And I have some thoughts too. I can.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I'll defer to Mike then.
Yeah. So again, this is a management determination on cleaning issues, right? Operations should be looking at that. They look at custodians, food service. And then, of course, we will share with the union, that we're following CDC guidelines and matters like that. And so it's ultimately a management decision, I believe, but there's a discussion on this extensively.
Right.
And I think to get to, Melissa, the question, like specifically in terms of who has to make this decision, is that in this instance, you're asking the food service workers to do something that they may already do in a typical situation. And while it's obviously a little different now that COVID is in our world, the fact that they typically do that, in my opinion, the management can just expect that they will continue to do that. If there's some concern raised by the union or the membership, they should bring that back to the management or the administrator who made this directive and say, this is how we're concerned about it, this is what else we need. But it's not as if you have to survey the food service workers and say, are you all comfortable with this, before you actually say, we'd like you to make sure that you clean the tables between meals and things like that.
Great. So now, as I mentioned, we're going to segue a little bit to more safety topics. Mike, you mentioned earlier that safety issues are a big concern. Let's dig into what that is a bit more. Can you talk about your experience in discussing safety issues with the unions?
And here's why this is important. Most contracts have a safe workplace provision. Now, in the past, what that meant was, from a environmentally safe workplace, and then, or just literally the safety of the well-being of the teacher, physical safety. But now you're combining pandemic implications with the workplace. And so, so the teachers have been, through their union representatives, indicating they need to provide with a safe workplace environment. So for example, if the districts are asking them to come back to in-person instruction, then the districts need to supply some personal protective equipment, masks, gloves, enhanced equipment for nursing or other medical staff, hand sanitizer, workplace wipes. We've seen demands for advanced safety equipment to the extent nursing or medical staff need to handle ill students. Unions have requested gowns, face shields, or the industrial level N95 face coverings and gloves. It's been asked that for example, that an area like that be cordoned off so that it prevents exposure to others. On the issue of the N95 masks, they may be utilized, but require specialized training before utilized in the workplace. Recent guidance from the Illinois Department of Public Health and ISB recommends the use of N95 masks for school, nursing, and custodial staff whose job duties may expose them to COVID-19. And indeed, OSHA, which is again the federal regulator of the workplace, has a requirement for a respiratory protection standard mandates that employers that requires that the use of N95 masks mandate a written respiratory protection program. And we've recently worked with a number of districts to implement this type of program. And then, we actually had some districts that keep counts of their level of PPE, share that with the union so that they can be assured that it's all available.
Great, thanks. Sally, do you want to add to some of your recent experience in dealing with this issue?
Sure. So I had mentioned at the beginning that unions have been more aggressive in addressing these issues than we've seen in the past. And some of you may have heard about this arbitration award that was issued against Chicago Public Schools. The collective bargaining agreement with the Chicago Teachers Union has a provision in it that says CPS will provide a safe and healthful working environment for the employees. That provision has been in the contract for decades, and frankly, I don't think has ever been used or cited. But the union did use it in the context of COVID-19. What CPS had done is required its school clerks to return to work in person. School clerks are basically the building secretary, the building assistant, the right-hand person to the principals who help them with so many administrative tasks. The union used that provision at arbitration to argue that COVID is dangerous. It's not well known. We don't know enough about how it's transmitted. We don't know, for example, all issues relating to ventilation, surface contamination, things like that. So CPS was not providing a safe and healthful working environment. They did not present a building by building analysis, but more just the general inherent danger of COVID-19. The arbitrators decided that better to err on the side of caution than not, and giving the inherent dangers, hazards associated with COVID-19, that if work can be performed remotely, it should be performed remotely. Frankly, there's a lot of flaws with the arbitrator's decision, and there are challenges to it, but it's an example of the tactics unions will take right now. And Jennifer, I touched briefly on ventilation, and I know that's an issue that you've seen coming up as well. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure, yeah. So the concern we're hearing raised by unions is about the alleged substandard air quality present in school buildings and the risk that poor ventilation and air quality could pose for COVID-19 transmission. So as part of raising those concerns, unions have in particular raised complaints about the types of air filters being used, and they've also raised those nebulous terms of industry standards and best practices. We've been hearing and reading their citations to studies indicating that the virus is likely transmitted in poorly ventilated areas. Looking at their studies that they're referencing with recommendations, again, from various industry groups, about increasing air filtration by upgrading filters to MERV 13 or higher. I don't know if you've heard those terms, but minimum efficiency reporting value, MERV filters, as well as installing HEPA filters in critical areas. The concern, we're not saying the concern is not valid, but the question is, at the end of the day, are you bargaining about the safe working conditions of the staff present in your buildings? Or is the union demanding to bargain about the type of HVAC system you have to install and maintain, perhaps purchase, as well as the external industry standards with which you should be complying and have to recognize? It bears noting many of the same studies and reports that the unions are referencing are suggesting recommendations. And perhaps more importantly, those reports, those studies, those recommendations are focused on the mitigation of the potential for the transmission through HVAC systems. Again, the emphasis is on mitigation. It's not a guarantee. Installing a certain type of filter is not a guaranteed elimination of the virus if these steps are taken. It's part of an overall system of procedures that you're establishing and have established already. Improving ventilation is part of those safeguards you're taking to ensure the health and safety of students and teachers and staff. The other steps obviously include social distancing, face coverings, quarantining people who are sick, staff who are sick. Again, it's getting back to what we've been talking about throughout this presentation, which is that distinction and that line between what do you have to bargain about and what do you not have to bargain about. And the idea that you're bargaining the purchase of an HVAC system with the union is, again, crossing and blurring those lines. With that said, we have been hearing unions asking about, whether there are certain safety assessments that have to be completed. Sally, I think you may have heard something specific about that.
Yeah, so several of the districts that I've worked with have unions asking, have you done a hazard assessment? And this is coming out of OSHA requirements. So OSHA has a requirement that employers are supposed to conduct workplace hazard assessments. Traditionally, that has only been minimally done in office buildings or schools because there's not the hazards that you think of with a manufacturing environment, for example. Where you may have seen this before is you probably, whether you've called it that or not, you've probably done a hazard assessment for your custodians. So that if your custodian is working with bleach, they're supposed to wear gloves and maybe they're supposed to wear goggles. or your maintenance worker is supposed to wear steel-toed shoes because of the nature of the work. Nurses having to wear particular equipment or PPE because of what they do. That's the traditional context in which a hazard assessment has come up, if at all. But unions are now saying, well, we want you to do a hazard assessment of the buildings, and carrying over to a lot of what Jen was just talking about relating to the ventilation system and all of that. Frankly, I think, and this is one of the questions that we received in the Q&A too, tying it to the standards that are out there is the appropriate thing to do. So when you look at whether it's CDC, IDPH, ISB guidance on what is required with social distancing, with mask wearing, with hand washing, with hygiene, all of those aspects, and making sure your buildings are in compliance with them is a significant part of doing any hazard assessment.
Great, thanks. Before we move on, there's another question in the chat that I want to throw to Jennifer. The question is, their contract expires in June. If the union wants to open a full contract, but the district may prefer an extension, does the district have any options?
In short, your options are limited. First of all, I want to be really clear. If the contract expires and they demand to bargain, and they are demanding to bargain about mandatory subjects beyond what you're contemplating within the scope of a one-year extension, legally, you cannot refuse to bargain about mandatory subjects of bargaining. So a steadfast refusal to not talk about health insurance, for example, or other benefits in the contract that are mandatorily negotiable. It's not going to fly. You're going to be drawing that ULP charge pretty fast and furiously. So it's really about bargaining priorities and your strategy at the table, and seeing if you can convince, with your best efforts, that an extension makes the most sense. And perhaps there are other incentives you're going to be able to negotiate in order to achieve that. But it really is going to come down to, can you convince them on the extension and the benefits of that?
Just adding something quickly to that, I think that just to be clear, when we talk about an extension, as Jen mentioned earlier, a true extension is typically just bargaining over wages or maybe one other issue. That being said, if the district is in a position where they do not want to be bargaining a 4-year contract right now because they don't know what the state of the world is going to look like next year, let alone in 4 years, there's nothing to prevent you from bargaining a 1-year contract, which is very different than an extension. Even though it's 1 year, you'd still have to go through and bargain all those topics that are presented to you by the union that you need to bargain. But in terms of, I have a number of districts who are just concerned about doing anything longer than a year right now, just because of the state of the world. So there is a difference between that I want to be sure. Just because the union says we want a 3-year deal doesn't mean that the district can't say, we'll bargain with you a successor contract, but we're only going to bargain a 1-year contract.
Thanks. So we're going to talk a little bit about cleaning protocols next. I know there's a question in the chat on that as well, but first, more broadly, Mike, can you discuss the cleaning protocol issues that you've seen?
Sure. It starts broadly, the building. They zero in right away on where staff will be, unionized staff. It's going to be if they're in the commons, even in the hallways, restrooms, how are those being controlled and modified? And then it focuses on the classrooms. Are the classrooms going to be cleaned? Will they be cleaned, every hour or after every class if students are moving back and forth? And who's going to do the cleaning? With respect to items that are touched often, that's something we're seeing our districts able to do, being staffed to do that. Waste paper baskets, are they being cleaned after every classroom? Unlikely. And who can do it? I know Shelley is going to speak on a few of these issues. But to give the supplies in there to the extent that there are individuals who will be assisting, like wipes and other things. But what the CDC requires is the heavy industrial cleaning for these active rooms daily at the end. So at the end of the day, so that when people come back in the next day, they are assured that their workplace is safe and has been cleaned.
So one of the questions that came up in the Q&A that really relates to this is, what happens if you have a teacher or another staff member who's in that classroom assigned, for instance, that doesn't want to do kind of the wiping down or cleaning of the desks or the high touch areas. The question is what do you do, and can you have the students do it? Now, there is language in, I believe it's in the IDPH or CDC, that talks about not having children engage in kind of these cleaning activities. I don't read that as not being allowed to ask kids to wipe down their desk areas. I have many districts I work with that they're having the kids who are leaving wipe down, as well as the kids who are entering wipe down. Now, in those instances where it is going to be some sort of wipe that's used, we are not using kind of high chemical wipes, and we are typically giving parental notice. So for instance, if a child were to have an allergy, the parent can say, my child can't do this. But when you really look at the science behind this, even soap and water on desks can help. So the idea that children can't be given a spray bottle and a piece of paper towel to wipe down their area, I really don't think that was the intent of the language with respect to children not being able to clean. And quite frankly, there are parents who want their kids back so badly in classrooms. I've got to imagine they're going to be okay with doing a little wipe down before and after to make sure that everybody's safe. So I certainly think you can do that.
Now, what have we seen regarding supervision of student lunch or other teacher break time? Sally?
Yeah, so that's another area where new issues are coming up, because schools that are doing in-person learning are having lunches and breaks in the classroom, right? You're not sending the kids to the cafeteria, they're staying in their classroom. Well, normally that time period was time for the teachers to plan or prepare for lessons or have their own lunch. And now suddenly the students are there. So it's another issue that has to be bargained. Is the teacher remaining in the classroom with the students? Is the teacher responsible for supervising those students? Is another adult brought in to the classroom to supervise the students during lunch? And how does the teacher get their break time?
Thank you. Has anyone seen any disconnect between the sentiment of the union members and the union's position at the table?
Well, I think I can touch briefly on this to get started. The one area that I have seen this really consistently in many of the districts I work with is everyone is concerned about mask wearing. There's no question about that. And all districts, most districts, would say that everyone in the building needs to be masked at all times. But one area that this has come up is to the kids who can't wear masks. Now, I'm not talking about kids in general education, but kids in a special education population, for whatever reason, truly cannot wear a mask or need significant mask breaks during the day. And we've had the union at the table saying that this should not be permitted, and we need to make those remote learners or do something else, and we have to restrict that. The interesting thing there, though, is that when you really dig down into having an administrator at the table who works with those special ed teachers or special ed paraprofessionals, they are, I have found in my experience, they're okay with it. As long as they're being given the appropriate PPE to keep themselves protected, they're not taking the position of, I can't work with an unmasked student. And making sure that dialogue is happening as to really what's on the ground. Now, certainly we can understand the union leadership wanting to take that kind of broad position because we all know it's safer to wear a mask. But, special ed teachers are a special population of people, and they are just amazing, and they want to work with these kids. And it's important to really understand kind of what they're willing to do and making sure you give them the other PPE they needed so that they're protected, even when the kids are unmasked, and make sure we get those kids back in school.
Mike, what demands have the unions been making with respect to workspaces?
Yeah, so we've talked about cleaning and the classroom, but there are other issues with respect to the classroom, and then I'll touch on what I'll call collateral workspace. And so what's going to happen for the districts is your operations staff are going to do a utilization assessment as to your classroom so that the students are socially, you're going to have less students, they're going to be socially distanced. That's the new setting for in-person instruction. Now, the issues come up, what about plastic desk shields? Are those helpful? Are those effective? They could be. The unions have talked about that. Classrooms often need to be provided with a new or enhanced equipment for the various teaching models. If it's solely remote, Teachers have complained about their laptops, that they're not equipped enough to really satisfy that model. What happens? You have half of your students in the classroom, again, and half away. Do I need a different type of a smart board to work with? Some of them has asked, okay, what I need is 2 computers. I need a laptop plus a camera. I need a separate camera, and then I need a desktop. I need extra power. And so IT has been brought in to speak to issues like that. And then what about these collateral spaces that teachers find themselves in if they're not in the same classroom all day? Where do they do their prep periods? How is that going to be set up? How do they know that that's, for them, a safe environment? Lunchtime, are they going to be in the commons? Are they going to be doing lunchtime? A lot of teachers don't want to do that now. So where will they be eating lunch? What about if they provide support services for students? Where are those going to be? Are those going to be in person, or are we going to be distance? Am I going to be doing that remotely? And then they want to know if the teacher's lounge or department offices are going to be available. So there's all types of these types of assessments that have to be done beforehand, so those questions can be answered at the table.
One other thing, Melissa, that's come up with respect to this in many districts I work with is the idea of, if you've got teachers, and typically this takes place more in a middle school or high school environment, but multiple teachers sharing one classroom, even when you're in a remote environment. So we know that ISB came out and clarified that if you are alone in a classroom, you can take off your mask. So for those teachers who were teaching, they were in class, but the students were at home, that they were permitted to take off their mask and teach via Zoom or whatever platform they were using. The issue that came up, though, is for the teacher who came in following them, was it unsafe for them to then take off their mask and teach because the air particles were in the room and there hadn't been any kind of cleaning done or time for that to have kind of cleared itself out. So certainly I've seen unions raise that issue, and there's been a number of different ways that I think districts have handled that. Obviously trying to make sure that individuals have their own workspaces to the extent possible, and getting creative with what those workspaces look like. So areas that you wouldn't typically use, making sure that we're utilizing every possible space, because obviously it's better in a Zoom platform, especially if we don't have a masked teacher attempting to teach, virtually.
Great. Now, Jennifer, what other areas have we seen unions make demands for remote work?
Sure, along the same lines of what Mike and Shelley just recognized, we've seen that unions have pushed a few items beyond the workspaces as they draw that line in the sand and demand to continue to work remotely. So those demands really largely have revolved around, first, professional development. Unions, as a general matter, are pointing out, look, instruction's occurring remotely. There's no reason why professional development should be treated any differently and not occurring and being performed remotely. Similarly, there's been pushback on the requirement that teachers attend IEP meetings in person rather than performing that work remotely via Zoom. And finally, parent-teacher conferences is really that third area where we've seen similar demands like this. Continuing that theme that with instruction being remote or predominantly remote, these conferences can and should also be performed, in the remote setting.
And I have to add something here, Melissa. I think everybody who's watching, who knows me, knows that I have kind of a freshman. And I have to say the parent-teacher conference is done virtually is the best thing that's ever happened. So if we could possibly continue that, I think it's really best for parents and teachers. So that has been the one takeaway that I will accept moving forward as well. So
Here, I agree.
Thanks, Shelley and Jennifer. Now I want to focus for a moment on testing and contact tracing. Mike, have you seen any demands for COVID testing?
Yeah, this has changed over the few months we've been in this already. From, hey, are you going to test every student? Raises a lot of issues, constitutional issues, arguably. Are you going to mandate every employee? Again, raises collective bargaining issues. I think it's become more reasoned in the approach. And so what about voluntary testing? What if I want to take a test? And so, yes, we've seen that. What some districts are doing, they're either working with hospitals or universities to try to establish a testing system to get a low rate cost for that, maybe have it go through the insurance company. And so that has been raised. This issue of contact tracing, it's really not a district obligation. It's a county obligation, but the district's going to be keeping necessary records, right? Which students are in this room or which teacher was assigned to this room. So yeah, that data has to be there in case it's needed.
Shelley, did you have anything to add to that? I think you had some specific experience with demands for that.
Yeah, I think there have been a number of initially, as Mike mentioned, kind of things have slowly evolved, but initially a number of unions just saying kind of off the bat, we want everyone tested every day, and that's the only way we'll feel safe coming back. And obviously we know that in the beginning that certainly wasn't going to be helpful because the test took so long to come back. With rapid testing, it makes a little more sense. In addition to what Mike's talking about, though, I know many districts that we work with are actually engaging with private companies to actually do the testing similar to what U of I is doing, or doing testing that's at least gives you some suggestion of whether someone's positive or not, and doing that kind of all students and staff. The interesting thing I've found is that some districts that are doing that, even where the teachers initially were demanding testing at the beginning, we don't have everyone signing up, right? So it's a question of making sure that everyone's committed to doing this so that it's as effective as possible to hopefully keep everyone in school for as long as you can.
Great. Now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about some information requests. Sally, what kind of union information requests have we been seeing?
Yeah, so we've talked a lot about collective bargaining obligations today, but another obligation that employers have to unions is to provide information that the union requests. And the scope of what unions are entitled to is very broad. If it is arguably related to their responsibility as the exclusive representative, they're going to be entitled to the information. And ultimately gets enforced through the Illinois Educational Labor Relations Board. And I can tell you they have an expansive view of what is relevant. So even though we touched on a number of topics that are not subject of bargaining, you probably do have to provide information if the union requests it about them. So we've been seeing a lot of information requests relating to HVAC systems, to which we talked about before. They want to know what kind of filters are in place. And, I certainly did not know a MERV 8 filter from a MERV 13 filter a month ago, but that has now suddenly become part of our repertoire and knowledge base. So that's an area we're seeing it. We're also seeing a lot of information requests relating to COVID cases. So unions want to know, have there been COVID cases? They may ask who it is, whether it's staff or student, what buildings, what contact tracing has been done, who is informed of it, and the like. That's another area where I'm seeing a lot of information requests.
Great, thanks. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I want to turn a little bit to job actions and then finally the union's tactics that we've seen in bargaining in the COVID area. So Jennifer, can you talk about what kinds of job actions you've seen?
I think it's actually less of what job actions I've actually seen take place and more of what job actions we have seen threatened by unions and employees and the credibility of those threats. I think we're all familiar with the traditional, what we'll call saber rattling that happens now and then in contentious contract negotiations. But continuing with our theme today about, the setting we're in right now and how truly different it is, the threat of the strike really has taken on a much different meaning and has occurred at much different junctures as far as timing is concerned. We've heard about, on a broad national level, places, where strikes are prohibited by teachers, and yet the strike authorization votes are either going forward or being threatened, and it's served as a very credible threat. It's not happening, but were they leverage and pressure early on to get districts who were contemplating returning to in-person learning to sort of take a step back and either delay or maybe change a decision? Arguably, yes. There's at least one district out there in Arizona. I think we heard a lot of reports about it early on. Teachers called in sick for the first day of planned in-person learning, more than 50%. So you saw that district sort of step back and sort of delay what was going to happen. So it's not really about what we're seeing actually happen. It's really about the credibility of the threat of that happening. And it's just more credible, I think, than it's been in years past.
Now, we talked about the unions being aggressive at the bargaining table, but now I want to talk a little bit about how they've been aggressive outside of the bargaining table, enforcing districts' hands, either via social media or other platforms. So Shelley, can you talk a little bit about what you've seen?
Yeah, sure. I certainly can get us started, and we only have about 4 minutes left. But just in terms of, I think that when things get contentious, typically is in the last few years when we've seen, unions take to social media, whether it's individually kind of on their own Twitter page or their Facebook page, or we have parents coming out and supporting them on social media. Here it's a little bit different because it's before things even get contentious necessarily. It's just a difference of opinion as to whether or not, for instance, we should be in a remote setting, a hybrid setting, and the union really being very vocal on social media about their position and why they have that position and why they don't, for instance, think it's safe to go back. We have that coupled with teachers who may individually not feel that what the district's decision is safe, or they don't want to do A, B, or C, or they think this decision was wrong. And being very mindful that the tactics of the union that they're using often can work because you get community support behind that. And the board may not be able to speak as directly to the union, to the public, the same way the union can. So that can be a little bit of an imbalance of power, but often, also reminding the, listeners out there that with respect to the teachers who are making claims as private citizens about their concerns, there's no doubt the return to in-person instruction is a public concern that we all share and what that looks like. So being mindful that teachers do have kind of broad availability to actually make statements that may not otherwise really feel right to the administration or to the Board of Education.
We've been getting a lot of questions about that, right? The teacher posted this on Facebook, the union has posted this on, Twitter, whatever. And can't we do something about it? And we get the frustration level, right? Because you're doing everything you can to provide a safe environment and you have all these precautions in place. And then you have someone saying it's not safe. Understand the frustration, but to Shelley's point, it's almost certainly going to be protected free speech that you're not going to be able to take any kind of disciplinary action against the employee for engaging in.
Great. Anything else, Mike or Jennifer?
I think there's a question about the role of the county declarations. I know we only have a couple of minutes. Again, depending on the level of the declaration and the specificity of it, it's an important provision. It is a local decision. They rely on both the Illinois Department of Public Health plus their own metrics. And so to the extent that they're now coming out and more aggressively recommending the adaptive pause, districts have to carefully consider that.
Thank you. Well, everyone, thank you so very much for joining us today. Please reach out if anybody has some questions that we did not answer. We are here to help. So thank you so much and have a great rest of the afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks a lot.